The morning of her wedding should have been the happiest day of Amelia Hart's life, yet as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of her hotel suite, a strange heaviness settled in her chest, as if her heart knew something her mind had yet to discover. She sat in front of the vanity, the scent of fresh peonies and roses filling the air, while her bridesmaids bustled around, adjusting veils and smoothing satin, their laughter a cheerful hum, but Amelia's eyes kept drifting to her own reflection, searching for reassurance, for certainty, for that glow brides were supposed to have, and finding instead a flicker of unease she couldn't explain, because everything was perfect. The church was decorated in ivory and gold, the reception hall glimmered with crystal chandeliers, and Daniel, the man she had promised to love forever, was waiting at the altar, handsome, successful, charming, the kind of man who made strangers envy her, and yet, as she tried to breathe in and banish her nerves, fate placed the first crack in the flawless picture. It was just after 9 a.m. when she excused herself from the room to fetch her grandmother's locket from the hallway table, the one she planned to wear over her heart, but when she stepped into the corridor lined with hotel doors, her satin slippers making barely a whisper, she heard voices, muffled but urgent, coming from the small service alcove around the corner. She wouldn't have stopped if one of those voices hadn't been Daniel's. Her first instinct was to smile and step forward, imagining he'd snuck over to surprise her before the ceremony, but then she froze, because the words she heard next were nothing like vows, nothing like love, nothing like loyalty. His low voice, sharp with impatience, saying, "After today, she'll have no idea. You'll get the money, I'll get the company, and we'll both get what we want." Amelia's breath caught, confusion knotting in her stomach, and then another voice, a woman's, silky, amused, replied, "And she thinks you're marrying her for love? Poor Amelia, she's too trusting, she'll never see it coming," followed by Daniel's chuckle, deep and familiar, except now it felt like a stranger's laugh, cutting through her like ice, and she stood there pressed against the wall, the hotel's wallpaper pattern blurring in her vision, each word hammering into her until the truth began to form. This wedding wasn't the start of her forever. It was a setup, a con, a betrayal crafted by the man she thought was her soulmate, and another woman whose voice dripped with cruel delight. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe, the shock rooting her to the spot, but then a burning heat rose in her chest, not just from heartbreak but from something sharper, anger, betrayal, a need for justice. And in that instant she knew she would not walk down that aisle like a lamb to the slaughter. She would not let him humiliate her, not in front of her family, not in front of the world, and certainly not without consequences. But she also knew that if she simply confronted him now, he'd deny it, twist the truth, and the evidence would vanish like smoke. So she forced herself to step quietly back into her suite, masking her trembling hands with a smile, letting the bridesmaids fuss over her while her mind raced with a plan that was still taking shape, something that would turn his perfect wedding day into the reckoning he deserved. She'd bide her time, gather proof, make sure that when she struck, it would be in front of every guest, every camera, every person who believed in the illusion Daniel had built. She thought of her father, who had passed away 2 years ago, of the promise she had made to him to live with dignity and strength, and a fire lit inside her that no tears could put out. As she sat there letting them pin the veil into her hair, she caught her own eyes in the mirror. No longer searching for reassurance, but reflecting something new, something dangerous, a calm, quiet resolve. The music would play, the guests would rise, the aisle would stretch out before her, but this time, she would be walking toward the truth, not the lie. And to everyone watching, friends, strangers, even those who didn't know her story yet, she silently promised, "You're about to see something you'll never forget." And for those listening later, for those who'd hear this story and wonder if they could ever stand up in the face of betrayal, she hoped they'd remember this moment, and maybe even subscribe to hear the rest, because what was about to happen would not just be a wedding, it would be the undoing of a liar, a public reckoning that no one in that church would ever forget. By the time the black vintage car pulled up to the front of St. Augustine's Church, Amelia's plan had crystallized into something sharp and unshakable. Her veil fluttered in the soft breeze as she stepped out, every eye turning toward her with admiration, seeing only the radiant bride and not the storm gathering behind her steady gaze. And as the bridesmaids followed, she held tightly to the small velvet pouch in her hand. Inside it the tiny wireless recorder she had borrowed from her cousin. Ethan, the tech-savvy one who had once worked in audio production, he had slipped it to her minutes after she'd whispered the truth in his ear, his jaw tightening in silent outrage, and in that moment she knew she was not alone. The heavy church doors opened, revealing rows of guests standing in reverence as the organ began to swell, and at the far end of the aisle stood Daniel, every inch the perfect groom, broad shoulders, confident smile, the faintest tilt of his head in mock tenderness. But Amelia now saw through every gesture, every curve of that smile, and instead of the girl who had once melted under his gaze, she became the woman who would dismantle him piece by piece. Step by step she moved down the aisle, her fingers brushing the tiny switch on the recorder in her bouquet, ensuring that Daniel's voice, the same voice she had overheard, would soon betray him to every soul present, because in the pouch was a small Bluetooth speaker, discreetly hidden beneath a floral arrangement at the altar, connected to the recorder and ready to play. When she reached him, Daniel took her hand with an easy warmth, leaning in just enough to whisper, "You look beautiful," and she smiled, not because she believed it, but because she wanted him to think she did. The priest began the ceremony, his voice solemn, speaking of love, trust, and unity, each word like an unintentional weapon aimed at the man who stood beside her, and when they reached the part where the vows were to be exchanged, Daniel spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced, painting a picture of devotion so convincing that a few guests dabbed at their eyes, but Amelia's heart remained ice, because she knew what truth waited in her bouquet. When it was her turn, she began softly, speaking of how she had believed in love, in loyalty, in the man she thought he was, and then, without breaking eye contact with him, she lifted the microphone ever so slightly toward the flowers and pressed the button. The church fell into a stunned silence as Daniel's own voice, recorded just hours earlier, filled the space. "After today, she'll have no idea. You'll get the money, I'll get the company, and we'll both get what we want," followed by the woman's mocking reply, "And she thinks you're marrying her for love? Poor Amelia, she's too trusting. She'll never see it coming." And then his chuckle, that cruel, unguarded laugh. Gasps erupted from the guests, a ripple of shock breaking into whispers, some rising to their feet in outrage, others staring at Daniel in disbelief, and Amelia didn't stop there. She let the full recording play, every damning word echoing through the vaulted ceiling, until even the priest stepped back, his expression one of grave disappointment. Daniel's face drained of color, his hands flexing at his sides as if he could physically push the sound back into silence, but the damage was already done. Amelia lowered the bouquet, her voice steady as she said, "You were right about one thing, Daniel, I'll never see it coming again. Because this is the last time you'll ever stand beside me," and with that she stepped away from him, turning to the guests with a small, dignified nod, her veil catching the light like a crown. The woman from the recording, now visible in the second row, flushed crimson as dozens of eyes pinned her with judgment, and whispers followed her as she shrank into her seat. Amelia walked down the aisle alone, each step a declaration that she refused to be broken, and as she reached the doors, the sound of applause began, soft at first, then swelling into a thunderous ovation from those who admired her courage. Outside, the cool air felt like freedom, the kind her father had always wanted for her, and as she glanced back at the church one last time, she smiled, not with bitterness, but with the knowledge that she had turned her heartbreak into power. And for those who would later watch this moment online, who would see the clip shared again and again, she hoped they'd take something with them. That betrayal can wound you, but it can also awaken you. And maybe they'd hit subscribe, because there were more stories like hers, stories where truth didn't hide, and where the ending belonged to the one who refused to be silenced.